There's a story told about a great circus performer. His name was Blondine. And he stretched a cable across Niagara Falls. Now, I don't know if you've ever been to Niagara Falls. We've had a chance to be there a couple of times. And it's massive and scary. And you're way up top. And this guy strung a wire across Niagara Falls. And during high winds and without any kind of safety net, he walked across it. He ran across that wire. He danced across the wire. And of course, there were, people that started gathering and watching this whole thing, and they were just amazed as they watched this guy doing all this stuff on this wire strung across Niagara Falls. He then proceeded to take a wheelbarrow full of bricks, and he pushed the wheelbarrow across this wire to the other side and then back again. And people were just going wild. They just thought that was the greatest thing that they'd ever seen. So when things calmed down a little bit, he stood there and he said, how many of you believe that I can take a person across this wire in this wheelbarrow safely to the other side? And everybody, by this time, they'd seen him do all this stuff. They're like, yeah, and they're all clapping. And they calmed down again. And he said, good. Who will be my first volunteer? And everybody who'd been cheering and clapping all of a sudden went silent. Those folks had a faith of observation, but not a faith of participation. God calls Christians to a faith that participates, not just stands on the sidelines, right? There's a lot of people, there's a lot of Christians, people that would call themselves followers of Jesus. They come to church and they talk about faith. They hear the stories about faith in the Bible. They believe them. They might hear somebody give a testimony, maybe a missionary, about something great that God's done, and they're wowed by it. And even when the pastor says something like, how many of you think that God can do anything? And they're like, yeah, amen, right there, amen. But when it comes time to step into the wheelbarrow, so to speak, and really trust God, the hands go down, the mouths go silent, and we're more satisfied to observe than we are to participate. The reality is that God has called us as followers of Jesus Christ into a walk, a lifestyle of faith. If you're here this morning and you're a follower of Christ, you call yourself a Christian, He has begun this journey with you, this journey of faith. And as you walk on this journey of faith, there'll come times that you'll be tested in this faith. And when you're tested in this faith, there'll be a tendency to be tempted to detour from the path of faith and follow a path of faithlessness. Your job as a believer is to trust God. We started off our whole service this morning talking about that from Isaiah 30. And in order to do that, God brings things into our life to help us to grow in our faith. But those growth experiences also, like I said, have a tendency to be detour experiences as well. Abraham was a guy most people would call a man of faith. And he was. But it wasn't always like that. God had called him into a relationship of faith. And Abraham came to a point in his life where there was a detour. And unfortunately, he took a detour that led to faithless failure. And this morning, I want us to look at that story and look at this detour that took Abraham in that direction so that we can learn how to avoid the same kind of detours that lead to faithless failure in our lives as well. So if you have your Bible, we are looking at Genesis chapter 12. And for many who've been in the church for a while, this may be a familiar passage, but I just want to walk through it to kind of get us up to speed before we actually get to the point of where Abraham is tempted to take this detour. Abraham is not a Jewish person at this point, because remember, Abraham is the father of the Jewish nation. He's living in a foreign country, and God shows up in verse 1 of chapter 12. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you." Now I want to stop there for a minute. God shows up to Abram. God says, "Abram, this is what I want you to do. I want you to pack up everything, your family, your livestock, your nephew, everything that you have, and I want you to take off, and I want you to go to a land that I'm going to show you." He doesn't say, "I want you to take off for this specific country, this specific province." He says, just take off. And as you go, I will show you the land that you're supposed to be at. Now you talk about a walk of faith. He didn't even get a map. He didn't get the name of the country. He didn't even get the area. God just said, start walking. And when you're there, I'll tell you. And this is what God says in verse 2. "And as you go, I will make you a great nation. I will bless you, make your name great, so that you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. And in you, all the families of the earth will be blessed." God basically says this, "Abram, look, I want you to take off. I want you to take all your stuff, all your family, all your people. I want you to take off to a land. I'm not going to tell you where it is. I'm not going to tell you what the name is. You got to trust me. When you get there, I'll tell you. And Abram, if you'll do this, I'm going to do amazing things through you. I'm going to bless you. And not only am I going to bless you, I'm going to bless your descendants. And not only am I going to bless you and your descendants, I'm going to bless everybody who blesses you. And I'll curse everybody that curses you." And Abram, just to let you know how grand this blessing is, through you, all the nations of the world are going to be blessed. Now, we know where we're sitting now how that happened. It was through Abram, through the Jewish people, that Jesus came about. And through Jesus, everyone has salvation who calls upon the name of the Lord. And so literally the nations of the world can be blessed because of the seed of Abraham, which was Jesus Christ. But Abram didn't know that at this time. So Abram has a decision to make here. Am I going to believe this God I hardly know? And am I going to trust him that what he says is going to come true? Well, verse 4. "So Abraham went forth." He says, "Okay, I'm going to do it, God. I'm going to follow you. I'm going to see what happens." He went forth as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot, that was his nephew, went with him. Now Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Abram took Sarai, his wife, and Lot, his nephew, and all their possessions which they had accumulated, and the persons which they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan. Thus they came to the land of Canaan. So Abram says, "Okay, God, I'm going to do it." He takes off. He takes all this stuff that he has. That's where his wealth was. It was in sheep. It was in livestock. He takes his nephew. He takes his wife. Now you got to imagine. Here's his wife, his nephew, all his servants. Abram stands up one day and he says, "Guys, we're moving. Where are we going?" "I don't know. We're going to take off." Excuse me, boss. Why don't you know where we're going?" "Well, I just need to let you guys know, God talked to me, and he told me that I should pack everything up and take you guys with me, and we're going to take off for an unknown land, and he'll tell us when we get there." And I'm saying, boss, I quit, and I'm out of here, right? But they all went. They all trusted, and they went. And look at verse 7. "The Lord appeared to Abram and said, 'To your descendants I will give you this land.'" Do you understand what happens there? Abram's moving just like God said. He's got everything with him. He's got his people. He's got his cattle. He's got all his stuff. And they're moving along. And every once in a while, of course, they have to camp out because, that's what you do when you're on a camping trip. And he camps out in this one place. And God shows up. He's in Canaan. And God shows up. And he says, "Abram, this is the land. This is it." Do you see? In verse 7, God makes good on his promise. God tells Abram in verse 1, listen, pick up, take off, go to a land that I will show you. In verse 7, he shows him. Here's the land. Here it is. And what's Abram do? Look at verse 7. It says he builds an altar. What's going on with the altar? He hears from God. God makes good on his promise. And Abram worships God. Wow! You're an amazing God. You made a promise to me. I took a big step of faith. I took my wife, my nephew, all my cattle, all my stuff, and my servants, and we went, and you said you'd show me, and you showed me, and here we are, and you spoke to me. I mean, you can imagine, he is on a spiritual high. He's heard from God this whole time. I mean, you can imagine, every time they stop to camp out, Abram's going, okay, God, is this it? Nothing. Okay, I guess this ain't it. Next night, they stop again. They camp out after walking for miles and miles. God, how about this? This looks like good land. God, how about, is this it? Nothing. And we don't know how long they traveled. We don't know, we have an idea of how far they traveled, but we don't know what they encountered while they traveled. The Bible doesn't tell us that. If they encountered, other bands of roving nomads or thieves or bad weather, we don't know any of that stuff. All we know is that Abram kept moving until verse 7, he hears from God and says, Abram, this is it. This is the land. And Abram goes, wow, and he begins to worship. And it's this fantastic thing. Have you ever been there in your life where you have this spiritual high going on? For some of you, it might not have been that long ago. You trusted Christ as your Savior within the last year. And man, you heard the story that Jesus loved you, died on the cross for you, and wants you just the way you are. And it hit you like a ton of bricks. And you said, wow, I want this, God. And you took him, and you were so excited. And man, you were just riding high. And you felt like every time you came to church and walked out the door, you were floating down the steps. You're just like, wow, why isn't everybody floating like me? You're just drinking it all in and excited. Maybe it's something that, maybe you've been saved for a while, but you've just, somehow you have spent some time with God recently, and man, you've just experienced His Word in a fresh and a new way, and you've been listening to His voice, and He's been directing you, and you've just been walking on cloud 9 too, and you just feel like everything's great. Man, you're right there. It's so exciting. I'm so in love with Jesus. I'm so excited, man. He tells me where to go and what to do, and I do it, and great things happen, and I can't wait. And that's where Abram was. Until, look what it says in verse 10. Now, there was a famine in the land. Abram's at this high spiritually. He's heard from God. God's came through on His promise. He's provided this land, which means, if God's going to come through on the promise for the land, then all the other things attached to it, the blessing for him and for his descendants and for the nations and everything, is going to come true, because that's what kind of God is showing Himself to be. And then all of a sudden, there's a famine in the land. Folks, this famine was going to prove to be the beginning of a potential detour away from a walk of faith. Would you put this down if you're taking notes this morning? Number 1 there. The detour from faith begins when faith meets famine. The detour from faith begins when faith meets famine. When famine comes, if you're not familiar with that term, when famine comes, the land stops producing. Now understand something. Here's Abram. Here's all his stuff. Here's his wife. Here's his nephew. Their part of the equation hasn't changed. Abram's been faithful. He stepped out. He went until God said, this is it. He's in the land that God said He was going to give him. His part of the equation hasn't changed. But all of a sudden, the land stops producing. Now, we don't know if it was because of drought or because of insect, but for whatever reason, they're in a famine. The land stops producing, and all of a sudden, he finds himself in a situation that's really tough. Because remember, Abram is basically a shepherd. He has hundreds, perhaps thousands of sheep. He's got servants to feed, a wife to take care of, a nephew he's responsible for. And all of a sudden, the land is not producing anymore. He's in a famine. And here's the situation. Here's his dilemma. He finds himself living on God's promise of this blessing and prosperity, but he's in the middle of a famine-stricken land. His circumstances were making it very difficult to maintain his faith. Now I got to ask you a question. Have you ever experienced famine? I'm not talking about a land kind of famine where there's no food growing because of drought. We've all been in drought here at Molokai. Excuse me. I'm talking about a famine in your life spiritually. You say, well, what is that? What does that look like? Well, would you put this down? A famine is a circumstance beyond your control that puts your faith to the test. It's a circumstance beyond your control that puts your faith to the test. Have you ever been to that point where, man, you're living in joy and peace and things seem to be going good and you're having a great relationship with God, He's talking to you, you're talking to Him, you feel like you're on top of the world, and then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, seemingly, a circumstance beyond your control hits you and you go, man, I'm having a hard time really trusting God all of a sudden. Ever been there? Man, I have. I'll give you the list of times sometime if you want. It's not just one or two times in my life. It's been multiple times. Things just seem to be going good. And you know, that's the funny thing about it. That's normally when it happens. Yeah. When everything seems to be cruising along good and you think your relationship with God's great and nothing seems to be going bad and you're just having a great time and you're enjoying worship in church and everything else, and all of a sudden, bam, this circumstance comes in. You didn't ask for it. You certainly didn't cause it. It just happened. And now you're in this crisis of faith situation. It may be, you know, you were praying for that new job. Man, if I could just have this job, man, it's more money, it's better hours. And you were praying for it and you got it. And you were just like, wow, God is great. He hears me, He provides for me, He blesses me. And then you discover a few weeks into the job, you got a jerk of a boss. And it's like, wow, Lord. Wow. I mean, you give me this great job, but you give me this jerk for a boss. And you're going, God, is this some kind of a cruel joke? I mean, what's going on? Oh, maybe it's your marriage. Your marriage seems to be going along pretty good. You think, you know, you're doing all right. And you know, you're trying to be a godly spouse and follow God's truth and principles in your marriage. And then all of a sudden, something comes up with your spouse that really rocks your relationship, and you're going, wow, Lord, what is going on? Are you there? I mean, this doesn't seem right. I'm trying to do everything right. Or maybe it's a situation that comes in. It's just a heart-wrenching, heart-aching situation. Maybe you get some physical illness. You're going, wow, Lord, I don't get it. I thought we were doing good here. What? Maybe it's a misunderstanding of motives. You did something for somebody or something, and they misunderstood your motives, and now they're against you, and you're going, whoa, wait a minute. That's not what God, help. See, all those things can be famine, folks. Famine puts you in that situation where the circumstance is testing your faith. And if you're not careful, famine will lead you down a detour to faithless failure. And that's exactly what happened to Abram. Look at verse 10 again. Now there was a famine in the land, so Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land. Now they want us to understand, as the story is being told, this wasn't just a light kind of famine that you're going to get over as soon as there's a big rain. It says it's a severe famine. This is bad. This is a bad situation. So here's Abram. He's trusted God. He stepped out in faith. He went when God didn't even give him the name of the country or the place to go. And he's just waiting for God's voice. And he waits day after day, week after week. And finally God says, Abram, guess what? You're there. This is the land. Everything's going good. He's enjoying life. Boom, severe famine comes. It's a test of his faith. He's in this circumstance where he's got to try to figure out, what am I going to do? Do I wait on God? Or do I take matters in my own hand? I mean, it doesn't seem like this land is very much of a blessing. God said I was going to be blessed, but this blessed land isn't producing a blessed thing. So maybe I should take matters into my own hand. And that's where he finds himself. And that's exactly what he does. He takes matters into his own hand. And what happens is, we're on this path of faith, and famine comes in. And number two, the detour from faith continues when the famine leads to fleeing. Abraham says, you know what? We can't stay here. We're going to Egypt. You say, well, where was Egypt? Well, if you look at a map where ancient Canaan was and where Egypt is south of Canaan. And can I tell you, when you flee from God's plan for your life, you always end up going south. You always go south. You never go north. You always going south. And that's exactly what Abram does. Hey, look, I don't know what's going on. I know God said this land was for us. He was going to bless us. We were going to be a blessing. But, you know, we're going to die. And my cattle are going to die. And my wife is grumbling every day. There's nothing to eat. Abram, let's go. And he finally says, okay, look, I'm not hearing from God. This famine's pretty severe. And so he packs up and he takes off for Egypt. Now, Scripture doesn't tell us that Abram ever asked God what he should do. You notice that? It just says famine comes up, Abram takes off. Now, it could be that if Abram had stopped and said, God, things are really bad. I'm not really sure what to do. I haven't really been walking with you that long, God. It's been kind of a short relationship with you and me, and I'm a little nervous about what's going on here, God. Should I go to Egypt? I hear they've got some food down there. Should I go? It could be that if he'd asked, God might have said, yeah, Abram, pack up, go to Egypt. But he never ask. As far as we know, he never checks in with God. He never asks. He looks at the situation. He decides it's bad. He needs to take off because, man, bad things are going to happen. Can you relate to Abram at all? Have you ever fled when your faith is tested? See, that's kind of our MO. When our faith gets tested, we don't like pain. We don't like discomfort. We don't like struggle. And so we take matters into our own hand, and that's just another form of fleeing. See, you're walking this path of faith, and the detour begins when a famine hits. And when that famine comes, then you're going to have a decision that you have to make. And that decision is to either stick with God's plan, even though it doesn't look good right now, or take matters into your own hand and flee. And that's exactly where Abram finds himself. We don't always flee physically, although sometimes we do. Sometimes we say, God, I just can't handle this anymore. And so we flee our job. Sometimes we get in situations and we go, God, this just is not, I can't do this anymore. So we flee our neighborhood. We flee our extended family. They're so lost, and I just can't deal with them anymore. And so we cut off ties and we flee from them. We even flee, sometimes we flee churches because somebody said something or did something or aren't doing something or aren't saying something. And instead of saying, God, is this where you want me? Are you going to use me in this family? We go, I'm out of here. And we flee. Sometimes it's not a physical fleeing. Sometimes we flee mentally. I can't deal with this, and we don't go to God with it, and it's overpowering us. so we'll immerse ourselves all that we can in technology. We'll watch TV, we'll tweet, we'll Facebook, we'll Flutter, whatever all this different stuff is, and we'll do all this stuff. And it's really escape. I just want to escape. I don't want to think about this anymore. We'll keep ourselves busy so that we don't have to think. We keep the radio on in the car when we're driving. We talk to people all the time, and I'm fleeing because I don't want to deal with it, right? Sometimes we go to more extremes. It's drugs, alcohol. I can't sleep because I got so much, so I'm just gonna take something, just a little something, just this once, and it turns into another once, and then before long, you're addicted. And it all started when you hit this famine, and you came to a decision point, and you had to decide whether you're going to continue this walk of faith with God, or you're going to say, man, God, I'm not sure where you are, I'm not sure what's going on, I'm fleeing. And you decide to take off. So what's the solution to that? If I'm in one of those situations, what should Abram have done? Would you put this down? Stay where God has put you until He tells you to go. Stay where God's put you until He tells you to go. Just stay. But I'm not hearing from Him, and it's not comfortable, and it doesn't feel good. Stay. Stay. Because it very well could be that what God's doing right now is He's working on your faith to grow it in Him. And you'll never grow in your faith until you're put in a famine. Never. When everything's going good, it's easy to trust God. When everything great is happening, when there's blessing, it's easy. God, you're so good. You're just my sugar daddy. Just give me more. Give me more, God. And when all of a sudden it gets cut off and we find ourselves in a famine, that's when it gets tough to trust. And that's when we have to really decide, do I want my faith to grow or do I want to bail on this deal? And we need to be people that stay where God has put us until He tells us to go. I love this quote from Pastor Warren Wiersbe. He says this, in times of testing, the important question is not, how can I get out of this? But what can I get out of this? You see the difference? Oh, God, get me out of this famine, man. This is bad. Come on, God, get me out of it. Instead of looking around going, whoa, wait a minute. Maybe God is using this famine in my life to make me stronger. And we know, in hindsight, looking at Abram's story, we know now, when we look at the rest of his story through Genesis, that that's exactly what God was doing. Because one day, 25 years later, God was going to ask him to do something really hard. He was going to ask him to sacrifice his son. But Abram never would have gotten to that point until he walked through some of these areas where he had to grow in his faith. And folks, you and I will never get to a point of faith, walking in faith with God, unless we face famine. And it's what we do with the famine when it comes up that determines how we're going to grow, or if we're going to grow. And so, Abram finds himself at this point where he decides to flee. Verse 11. It came about when he came near to Egypt that he said to Sarai, his wife, see now, I know that you're a beautiful woman. And when the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. And they'll kill me, but they'll let you live. Because I'm ugly and you're pretty, and they're going to let you live and I'm going to die. So please say that you're my sister, so that they go well with me because of you, and that I may live on account of you. Sarah, my life is in your hands. Please be kind to me and say you're my sister. I'll do whatever you want, Sarah. I mean, she had him right there. Huh? She's got him right there. Oh, yeah, Abram? Yeah, you know those curtains I saw? You know, whatever. She's got him. What happened? Well, look, Abram's walking this path of faith. He's on this road of faith. Things are going good. And the detour to faith begins when faith meets famine. And it really continues when famine gives way to fleeing. And what we see here is the detour from faith advances when fleeing gives way to fear. And that's exactly where Abram was. He was afraid. Wow. You say, how did this guy get so afraid where he's asking his wife to lie? Well, here's the deal. As Abram flees and he gets further from God's plan, see, the land was God's plan. Abram, this is where I want you. This is where I'm going to bless you. This is where I want you to stay. So when Abram leaves the land, he leaves the plan. And the further he gets from God's plan, the further he gets from God's presence. And the further you get from God's presence, the greater opportunity for you to fear. Because you're no longer in the presence of the Almighty, right? And that's exactly what happens to Abram. He finds himself further and further from God's plan and where God wanted him, and so he's further from God's presence, and God's basically just standing up there watching this whole deal, going, okay, Abram, that's what you want to do. Go ahead. I'll be right here. I'm waiting for you. I'm watching this whole thing. Man, are you a chicken? Asking your wife to lie because you're afraid to die. You're a big wimp, Abram. Ever find yourself there? When you're in a situation, you go, look, I know this isn't right, but I'm not hearing from God. I don't know what He's doing. Let's just tell this one lie this one time. Let's just cheat this one time on this. Let's just take this thing just this one time. Would you put this down? Abram was terrorized by the potential instead of trusting in the promise. You relate to that? Usually it works like this. I call it the what-if game. We begin to play the what-if game in our mind. Well, what if this happens? And what if that happens and this person reacts this way? And what if they react this way and then this happens? Oh man, it's going to be bad. And what happens is, see, God has given us this great mind. We have great imaginations. But the what-if game just takes that imagination to a whole new level, and we start thinking about what the potential could be instead of the promises that God has given us, and we start freaking out because, well, this could happen, and if it happens, I'm in big trouble. And that's what Abram did. Look, they're going to see you, and they're going to think you're beautiful, and what if they do? Then I'm dead, and so... See? You find yourself there? You ever find yourself there? And see, what happens is we find ourselves being terrorized by what could happen instead of going, wait a minute, I'm a child of the King. He's made a promise. He's made so many promises to me in the Word. He said that He'll never leave me or forsake me. He said in Philippians 1:6 that He who began a good work in me, He will be faithful until the day I see Jesus Christ. Now, the important thing about that verse is that He will be faithful. So many times we're not faithful. But He'll always be faithful as long as we're holding on to Him. And He's given us so many of these promises. And Abram finds himself with a promise, but he's facing a famine. And so he decides, man, I'm going to flee. And as he flees, he freaks out. He fears. So what's the solution? Well, the solution for Abram would have been this. He needed to review the character of God and His promises often, especially when you're in a famine. Wait a minute. God is a good God. He loves me. He's got best for me. God's made these promises to me. Abraham needed to stop and go, whoa, wait a minute. What are we doing? What? Why are we going to Egypt? This is nuts. God spoke to me back there and told, you know what? We're going back. God's made a promise, and I'm screwing it up. I'm going back. If he would just have rehearsed the promise and the character of God, then maybe he could have gotten off the detour at that point. But he didn't. So he finds himself on this walk of faith, and he hits this famine, and the famine brings him to this point where he goes from the famine to fleeing, and as a result of the fleeing, he goes into fear. And then number 4, the detour from faith peaks as fear gives way to failure. Abram fails miserably in this whole deal. And I want to show you what happens. Look at verse 14. And it came about when Abram came to Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful. Whoa, it came true. He was right. They looked at Sarah. She must have been something else. I mean, she's a 65-year-old hottie. And they're looking at her going, hey, wow. And Pharaoh's officials saw her and praised her to Pharaoh. Pharaoh, she ain't going to believe what just walked into the country. I mean, this is a babe, Pharaoh. And the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. Pharaoh wanted the best harem. Hey, bring her in. Therefore, he treated Abram well for her sake, because he's thinking Abram's the brother, right? Hey, you got a hot sister, man. Here's some sheep. And he gave him sheep and oxen and donkeys and male and female servants and female donkeys and camels. He's just loading Abram up, and Abram's going, whoa, whoa, I should lie more often. Look at all this stuff I'm getting, right? But do you realize what's happening here? He failed. Would you put this down? He failed to protect his wife, and he put her in a dangerous and a sinful situation. When you detour from faith, you put people around you, especially those dependent on you, in spiritual danger. And let me just direct this specifically right now to men. Guys, listen. As the spiritual leaders of our home, when we take the detour toward faithlessness, it's going to lead to failure, and it's going to affect those closest to us, our wife and our kids. We put them in spiritual danger. And that's exactly what Abraham does. He puts his wife in danger, in a bad situation. All Pharaoh needed to do is go, yeah, hey, come on, we're going to spend the night together, baby. Let's go. And now you've gone from having your wife living with a guy to having your wife sleeping with a guy because you're afraid to die. And so Abram, man, this detour, because he didn't deal with the famine right, he ends up fleeing. He's all fearful. It ends up in miserable failure. He puts his wife in this dangerous situation. Look at verse 17. But God now has to step in. The Lord struck Pharaoh and his house with a great plague because of Sarai, Abram's wife. God says, well, I ain't letting this happen. Abram, you really screwed up here, buddy. But I'm going to step in right now because this ain't going to happen the way it's going down. And so he strikes Pharaoh with this plague and his whole household. So you go, well, isn't that good? Well, yeah, it's good because God steps in and saves the situation. But what happens? Would you put this down? He failed to be the blessing that God intended him to be, and he became a curse instead. You remember back there at the beginning of the chapter? Abram, man, you go to this land that I'm going to show you, you are going to be blessed. And you're going to be a blessing to everybody else. God wants Abram to be this conduit of blessing to other people. But because he gets detoured off his walk of faith, he ends up failing miserably, and as a result, he becomes a curse to Pharaoh and his household rather than a blessing. He just failed big time. Goes on. Verse 18. Then Pharaoh called Abram and he said, what is this you've done to me? He figures it out. We don't know how. If Sarai said, look, I know why you're sick. It's because my chicken husband, he didn't want to die. We don't know. But somehow he finds out and he says, what is this you've done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say, she's my sister, so that I took her for my wife? Now then, here's your wife. Take her and get out of here. That's really what he's saying. Just go. What is wrong with you, man? Why did you do this to me? He failed to be an example of righteousness, and instead he was disgraced by the unrighteous. Pharaoh wasn't a righteous guy. He didn't believe in God. Abram was supposed to be a testimony of righteousness. He shows up, he lies, this whole thing goes down, Pharaoh gets cursed. Pharaoh ends up rebuking the man of faith. You know what's crazy, folks? Sometimes the world knows better how we should act as Christians than we do. And it's a sad day when the world rebukes us for things like a lack of love. when we're supposed to be the most loving people there is. It's a sad day when the world rebukes us for being unforgiving, when we should be the most forgiving people out there. And what happens to Abram, because he hits the famine, makes some bad choices, finds himself in the situation that he finds himself in, he fails miserably to be all that God wants him to be. He puts his wife in a bad situation. He ends up being a curse and not a blessing, and he ends up getting rebuked by an unrighteous king. Man, failure. You know, we would say epic fail, Abram. Man, huge, huge, buddy. How did this happen? How did this happen? How did he get to this point? Well, the detour from faith begins when faith meets famine. And then as you move along, the detour continues and advances when famine leads to fleeing. And then it continues on from there when fleeing turns into fear. And ultimately it climaxes, it peaks when fear ends up being spiritual failure. That's exactly the path that Abram took. And I got a hunch that most of us in here can relate to this story and go, man, I've been there too. Yeah. The cool thing about it is, Abram didn't stay there. He got back onto the road of faith. And you say, well, how do you do that? Because Rand, you know what? What you just described, I'm in it right now. And I want to get back on the road to faith. Great. Chapter 13, verses 1 through 4. Look what it says. So, he gets kicked out of Egypt. So, Abram went up from Egypt to the Negev, that's the south part of Canaan. And he and his wife and all that belonged to him, and Lot, his nephew, with him. Now Abram was very rich in livestock and silver and in gold, and he went on his journey from the Negev as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place of the altar which he had made there formerly, and there Abram called on the name of the Lord. Do you see what's going on? Abram packs up his stuff and he goes, guys, we're leaving Egypt. And you got to know, he went with his tail between his legs. He knew, man, I screwed up royally. I really failed. Guys, we're going back. There probably wasn't a whole lot of conversation on that few-day trip out of Egypt back up to where they had come. But notice where Abram goes back. He goes back to the place that he had originally heard from God, built an altar, and worshiped Him. You want to get back on the road to faith? Would you put this down? Go back to your altar. You go, what's my altar? The altar is the place where you meet God. It's where you meet God. Look, if you're not spending time with Him, meeting with Him so that He can speak to you and His Word, and as you pray and you hear from Him, then of course you're going to be easily detoured when a famine comes. Of course. But if you want to get back on that path, that road to faith, man, get back to your altar. So he goes, man, you know, I can just remember having great times with God, and man, I hearing from Him, He spoke to me. I can remember just, I would come to church on a regular basis. I just leave and I feel so, but you know, I haven't been reading my Bible. I haven't been spending time with God, and we haven't been coming to church much. We're kind of hit and miss, and man, I just hit this situation and it just seemed like God wasn't there, and I saw myself just making all these bad decisions, all these bad choices, and I don't know how to get back. Get back to your altar. Do those things you know you were doing before where you met with God. Get back there. Go back to the altar. Go back to the place that you know you need to be. And He'll meet with you again, and that's exactly what happened with Abram. God fellowshiped with him again, and he got back on the path. You say, so everything was great from that point? No, he had other famines. But each time he learned and he grew. And by the time we get to near the end of his life, God asks him to do this amazing thing, sacrifice your son. And he goes through with it. And of course, God doesn't make him do it. But we get to see in hindsight the amazing transformation in faith this man made, because he had to face famine and because he had to face the decisions that went with it. And folks, if you're truly a child of God this morning, let me tell you, you will face famine. You will. God will allow famine to come in your life to grow your faith. The question is, what will you do with it? Will you let your famine lead to fleeing? Will you then go into fear? Because if you do, you're destined for failure. And God doesn't have that for you. He's got a walk of faith that'll be grown as you make the right decision in the famines that you'll face. Would you bow your head, please, and close your eyes?